Private First Class. Hans Richter expected chains and punishment when the Americans captured him. Instead, he was sent to a place built on fantasy, a sprawling Hollywood backlot where his greatest fear was replaced by the bizarre absurdity of fake Roman ruins. But the most shocking thing he would witness wasn't the illusion of cinema. It was the quiet, unscripted moment when a desperate B-list actor offered a German prisoner his untouched lunch. The dust of the Mojave was not the sand of the Sahara, and yet Private First Class Hans Richter felt the same crushing heat pressed down on him as he pushed his wheelbarrow across the fake cobblestones of a synthetic Roman forum. It was the summer of 1944. War had delivered Hans, a former university student captured in Tunisia, to the absurdity of a Hollywood backlot in California. Hans, 22, had spent weeks braced for the worst: chains, brutal labor, and the deep humiliation promised by propaganda. His reality was this: pushing refuse past the 12-foot papier-mâché statue of a Roman emperor while a bored American guard chewed gum nearby. The air here smelled not of gunpowder, but of fresh sawdust, grease paint, and the faint, sweet scent of movie catering. This lot was a monument to make-believe, a kingdom where ancient Rome bordered a two-dimensional Wild West saloon. For Hans and the 40 other German prisoners of war assigned here, the daily work was less punishment and more a fever dream. They cleaned up after film crews, moved foam boulders, and polished oversized six-shooters. What truly confounded Hans was the scale of waste and the unbelievable abundance. Back in Germany, every scrap of food and every working hour was dedicated to survival. Here, the machine never stopped. American industry was so confident, so limitless, that it could divert vast resources simply to build magnificent, detailed fantasies. It was a cultural shock that went deeper than any fence. Their American guards treated the prisoners not with malice, but with weary indifference. The rules were strict: no talking, no eye contact, but the threat felt distant, like a B-movie script. Hans often stared at the mundane details: the mountain of clean laundry, the ice that seemed to appear everywhere, and the huge, gleaming trucks. He realized the American weapon was not just the bomber or the tank. It was this industrial calm, this effortless capacity to create abundance. It was a power that held more confidence than 1,000 battle speeches. He pushed the wheelbarrow toward the carpentry shop. He had been taught to despise the American soldier, but realized the men he encountered here were merely cogs in this massive machine of excess. As the afternoon shadows lengthened, Hans saw a cluster of people gathering by the western set, the crew assembling for the day's final scene. Up close, the fake heroes of the American dream were about to perform. The war had placed him in a world made of lies, but it might still hold a small corner of unexpected truth. The B-list cowboy arrived not with a flourish, but in a cloud of exhaust from a sputtering Chevrolet convertible. This was George Geo Sterling, whose face was always slightly too familiar to be anonymous and too forgettable to be truly famous. Hans watched the performance daily. Geo would emerge, already in costume, fringed leather vest, Stetson hat, and genuinely old boots. He carried an air of practiced, desperate arrogance, barking for coffee and demanding the prop master check his pearl-handled revolver. But his eyes betrayed him. They held the perpetual tension of a man worried about his standing on the call sheet. The rules governing the prisoners were absolute. They were invisible, silent, and entirely separate. To speak was an offense. To make eye contact risked confinement. Yet Geo Sterling seemed determined to break the rules through need for attention. He would practice his trick roping too close to the prisoners or loudly rehearse his lines. Hans learned the actor's schedule: makeup, riding practice on the tired horse named Duke, and the inevitable tirade about his shrinking role. Geo was a reflection of the fake world around them, a veneer of grandeur covering insecurity. The irony was profound. German prisoners who knew the reality of war were building a set for an American terrified of not being a hero. One afternoon, as Hans moved a barrel, Geo missed his footing, landing hard with an undignified oomph. The cameras were not rolling, and the crew snickered. Geo scrambled up, brushed off his trousers, and immediately launched into a string of curses, blaming the horse, the boots, and the script itself. It was a tantrum that revealed the fragile man beneath the costume. For Hans, the moment was a small, unsettling revelation. He had been told American men were invincible paragons of efficiency. But here, seeing the flushed face of the actor, he saw only a desperate worker, afraid of losing his job. Geo Sterling was just as much a cog in the overwhelming American machine as Hans, though Geo's anxiety was about fame, while Hans's was about survival. Geo was approaching the catering table, tossing his hat onto a crate, the picture of theatrical frustration. The actor's performance had ended, replaced by the palpable human anger of disappointment. Hans felt the invisible line between their two worlds, the prisoner and the player, thinning. If you'd like to keep following the surprising story of Hans and Geo, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next chapter of this incredible true moment in history. The noon siren signaled the most jarring contrast of the day. The American lunch break. The oppressive heat was cut by the scent of civilization, roasting meat, fresh citrus, and the deep aroma of coffee. For Hans and the prisoners, the routine was discipline. They filed into a separate, screened-off area, their meal strictly adhering to the Geneva. Conventions was monotonous, thin, watery vegetable stew and a single dry piece of bread. They ate quickly, the quiet ritual a necessary defense against captivity. Just beyond their barrier, the feast for the film crew was laid out. This was not food for survival, it was food for delight. Hans could see and smell the unimaginable banquet. Massive silver trays held thick-cut roast beef, glazed ham, and pyramids of fresh, colorful fruit. There were steaming tureens of creamy soups and an astonishing array of pastries. The ham glistened. The bread was thick. He saw 3 full cakes. This was not food. It was insult. Hans, whose family had been subsisting on rationing for years, found the sight morally bewildering. It was not just the quantity. It was the casualness of the abundance. He watched a young cameraman take an entire plate of roast beef, eat half, and discard the rest into a waste barrel. This careless excess stood in brutal opposition to the scarcity of his own. The propaganda had failed to convey the full picture. It had promised a soulless factory slave, but Hans was witnessing a machine that could build tanks and an endless supply of fresh bread rolls. They could feed their prisoners adequate rations while simultaneously treating their own B-list actors to a king's spread. Geo Sterling was seated nearby, trying to eat his enormous roast beef sandwich with exaggerated disinterest. Hans's eyes tracked the actor's jaw. He was intensely hungry, a deep ache his stew could not touch. The actor took a large, unnecessary bite, frowned, and set the sandwich down. Hans quickly looked away, ashamed of his envy. But the sight remained. An enormous monument of food, temporarily abandoned, a profound symbol of the distance between his world and Geo Sterling's. The physical distance was only about 20 feet, but the emotional gulf spanned an ocean of war and ideology. The heat pressed against the saloon set. This scene was meant to be the climax of the day's filming, Geo Sterling delivering a heroic speech about justice. Geo was sweating beneath the costume, his face caked with theatrical dirt. The director Thorne called action, and Geo launched into his lines. He spoke of virtue and order. He flubbed the final key sentence, the one meant to send a ripple of righteousness, and stopped dead. "Cut!" shouted Thorne. "Geo, that's the 3rd take. Where is the fire?" The tension became immediate and uncomfortable. Geo demanded water, then snapped at the script supervisor, claiming the lines were clumsy. He was fighting his own limitations and losing. Hans, positioned by the prop wagon, had a front-row seat to the humiliation. Geo, unable to bear the scrutiny, ripped his Stetson hat off and hurled it into the dusty street. The pain in the actor's eyes was real. He had tried to be the hero and failed. In that instant, the distance between the German prisoner and the American actor evaporated. Hans saw not an enemy, but a man, struggling. In Hans's world, failure meant capture. In Geo's, failure meant obscurity. Yet, the core emotion, the shame of falling short, was universal. The script called for Geo to be fearless, but the man was crippled by fear of irrelevance. Geo stood there, chest heaving. He was exposed, his eyes sweeping the set in search of an escape, snagged on Hans. The German quickly looked back down at the ropes, violating the strict rule against eye contact. But it was too late. Gio had seen him watching the collapse. The actor, reminded that his failure was witnessed by an actual enemy, felt a fresh surge of embarrassment. The set was frozen. The only sound was the faint hum of the camera equipment. The anger left Gio's face, replaced by a strange, unsettling quietness. Hans knew he had crossed an invisible boundary simply by observing a man's genuine vulnerability. He felt the actor's gaze fixed on him, a silent, heavy weight. The two men were dangerously, compellingly close. The air settled over the backlot as the crew nervously waited for the director's mood and the actor's temper to cool. Hans was immediately detailed to clean up the area around the western set's water trough, near where Gio Sterling's tantrum had unfolded. Hans worked with methodical precision, maintaining the required posture of non-existence. He was acutely aware that Gio Sterling was standing just 10 feet away retrieving his Stetson. Gio walked slowly, deliberately, but his silence was more noticeable than any shout. When he finally stood still, he leaned against the prop truck bumper, pulling the wide-brimmed hat low over his eyes. The entire set, cameramen, grips, costume staff, slowly quieted. They sensed the weight of the moment, the actor, still bristling from his humiliation, standing motionless beside a German prisoner. The two men were separated by the slimmest margin of pavement, yet stood on opposite sides of a global conflict. The collective attention of the film crew was fixed on the silent standoff. The clock was ticking on the expensive production, yet no one dared to break the spell. Gio's hand remained stiffly at his side, gripping something that looks impossibly huge and substantial. The leftover half of his catered lunch. It was the monstrous roast beef sandwich, its savory aroma competing with the scent of hot metal and dust. He was not looking at Hans, but at the ground, wrestling with the lingering shame of his failure. He was trapped, and Hans was the only witness. Hans kept scrubbing the trough, his movements slow and controlled, refusing to acknowledge the heavy gaze. He thought of the strict military code he had been raised under and how quickly it had all crumbled into chaos and hunger. The air grew heavier. The actor's breathing was audible, strained. Hans felt a bead of sweat crawl down his spine. The silence of the film crew amplified the moment into something dramatic, more profound than any scene they had filmed all day. The camera crew was ready to roll. The director was tapping his foot, yet the operation remained suspended, waiting for the outcome of this quiet confrontation. Gio Sterling tightened his grip on the sandwich. Then slowly, hesitantly, he looked up, his eyes meeting Hans Richter's for the first time. The great divide of war, fear, and propaganda was reduced to a single, tense moment of choice. The tension is almost too much. The entire crew has stopped to see what happens next. What do you think Gio Sterling will do with the sandwich? Share your thoughts in the comments below before you read on. The moment stretched taut as piano wire, a tiny fragile pinprick of human contact held suspended within the indifference of a massive war. George Sterling, the man who pretended to be a hero, slowly shifted his weight, and then, without a single word, he pushed his hand forward, holding the colossal roast beef sandwich toward the German prisoner. It was an offer that defied all rules, the American extending a gift to the enemy, the POW, forbidden even eye contact, now facing the most intimate act of courtesy. For Hans, the internal conflict was paralyzing. His training screamed rejection. Accepting charity was an act of shame. The propaganda that had defined his youth collided violently with the raw reality of his hunger. Gio Sterling offered no pity, no theatrical gesture. It was a simple offering of food, an acknowledgement of shared human need. It was this lack of drama that made the act so profound. He simply stood there, waiting, his hand steady. The entire film crew watched, silent as shadows. They saw not a prisoner receiving a handout, but two working men suspended in unexpected grace. The silence was the real currency of the moment. Finally, driven by need, Hans's hand moved. Slowly, with immense care, he reached out and took the package. His fingertips brushed Gio's palm, and the warmth of the fresh bread transferred to his hand. Hans did not look at the actor's face. He simply tucked the sandwich close to his body. Gio offered a nearly imperceptible nod and then turned to retrieve his hat. The moment was over. Mr. Thorne snapped, "All right, let's get back to work. Places, everyone." The frantic energy of the set immediately surged back to life. But for Hans, the world had fundamentally shifted. Holding the weight of the sandwich was a more tangible reality than any heroic speech or official decree. This piece of food, casually shared by an insecure American actor, was an antidote to every hateful lie his nation had fed him. It was the first true evidence he had seen that his enemy possessed an effortless generosity that was neither a trick nor cruelty, but merely the default setting of a confident man. The raw taste of the roast beef was the taste of mercy. He stood there, protected by the sudden, profound knowledge that in this land of impossible plenty, kindness could exist as casually as a throwaway meal. The world of the Hollywood backlot had become noisy once more, but for Hans Richter, everything had receded into a distant hum. His focus was entirely on the sandwich, the savory crunch of the bread giving way to the rich, tender texture of the roast beef. He and Geo Sterling sat side by side on an upturned wooden crate, separated from the activity by the prop truck. It was a mundane miracle, the American actor and the German prisoner of war sharing a meal in silence. When Geo finally broke the silence, his voice was quiet, stripped of bravado. "It's the heat," he mumbled. "Hard to remember lines in this heat. Makes your head thick." Hans nodded. He managed a single word: headaches. The simple exchange, anchored by the physical closeness and the profound relief of shared food, instantly shattered years of conditioning. The warmth of the cold water was a small comfort, but the truth of the man beside him was the real nourishment. Geo did not ask about the war or politics. He talked about his frustration with the script, his envy of the lead actor, and the constant fear of losing his job. He treated Hans not as a symbol of the enemy, but as a temporary colleague. "Where you from?" Geo asked suddenly. Hans hesitated, but Geo merely shrugged. "Don't matter. You look like a man who spent time with books." Hans managed to reply, "Leipzig, University." Geo laughed. "Figures. I was studying drama. Guess we're both still performing history, huh?" The profound realization settled over Hans. This American was merely a person consumed by the same small, anxious concerns that afflict all men: money, security, dignity, and fear of failure. The ideological hatred that had been poured into Hans for years dissolved in the face of this shared human fragility. The great enemy was not cruel. He was insecure. Geo finished his last bite, crumpled the wax paper, and tossed it into the back of the prop truck. He stood up, stretched, and looked down at Hans. "You keep the rest of that," he said, gesturing toward a small thermos of cold water. "Don't let Thorne see you with it. He's a stickler for rules." It was a moment of simple conspiratorial kindness. The actor adjusted his belt, ready to return to his stage. Hans watched him walk back toward the set. Hans realized that the greatest revelation of his captivity was not the abundance of America, but the simple, unassuming vulnerability of its people. His heart, long hardened by propaganda and fear, felt a profound, unexpected lightness. While Geo Sterling prepared for yet another take, the director, Mr. Thorne, watched the German prisoner, his expression shifting from irritation to contemplation. Thorne had not missed the silent exchange nor the quiet dignity of the two men sharing the meal. The director instantly recognized the quiet power of a genuinely unscripted human moment. The shared sandwich held more truth and dramatic weight than the overly heroic dialogue. Thorne quietly motioned for his first assistant director and cameraman. The word rewrite was whispered. Thorne explained that the final scene, Geo Sterling's big moral speech, felt suddenly false. The new scene, he decreed, would be silent. It would focus not on Geo's words, but on a single, meaningful act. The new instruction was simple. Geo's character would simply offer a crucial item, a canteen of water, a piece of bread, to a weary refugee. The crew understood immediately. They paused their work, recognizing that the director was transforming their movie into a statement of quiet virtue. Every single member of the crew felt the weight of the change, realizing this act of kindness just transformed their message. The cameraman, Al, prepared to capture the scene not as spectacle, but as an intimate portrait. When Geo Sterling returned to his mark, the director briefly explained the change. Geo, initially confused that his big speech had vanished, caught sight of Hans Richter nearby. Understanding spread across the actor's face. He knew exactly where the inspiration had come from. Mr. Thorne called action, and the final scene began. Geo dismounted slowly, walked toward the weary woman and child, and offered his canteen with a shared empathy. It was quiet, understated, and astonishingly effective. As the cameras rolled, Geo subtly glanced toward the shadows where Hans was sweeping. For a flicker of a second, his eye met the German's, and Geo gave the slightest invisible wink. It was a silent acknowledgement. We did this. You helped write the real story. Hans watched, witnessing the kindness he had experienced translated into cinematic art. He realized that even in this industry of lies, there was an honest hunger for truth. The scene finished perfectly. The film crew applauded for the moral clarity of the moment. Hans returned to his barracks that evening with a profound understanding that the most powerful form of American confidence was its ability to acknowledge quiet decency, even in its own fiction. This moment, the quiet offering of a sandwich, is a small act that speaks volumes about dignity and humanity. If you believe such profound moments should be remembered, please share this story with someone who appreciates true, human-centric history. The final weeks of filming passed quietly. By late spring of 1945, the rumors became confirmation. Germany had formally yielded. For the German prisoners of war, the end of the conflict brought dread and relief. They were now displaced men waiting for repatriation to a shattered homeland. On the backlot, the labor detail was winding down. Hans and his comrades had become an integrated part of the film community, known for their work ethic. Local church groups visited the camp, bringing small boxes of gifts. On the last Tuesday of their assignment, a military truck arrived. The goodbyes were understated. The guards offered polite farewells. Hans packed his few belongings, letters, and his worn university textbook. As he walked toward the camp bus, he saw Geo Sterling standing beside his sputtering Chevrolet convertible. Geo was out of costume, looking like a man facing unemployment. He waited until the stream of prisoners had passed before he approached Hans. "Richter," Geo said, "they tell me you're headed home." Hans nodded. "It is time." Geo shifted his weight, looking uncomfortable. He wasn't offering food or frustration. This was a farewell. Geo reached into his pocket and pulled out a small item wrapped in soft, worn leather. He handed it to Hans. It was a prop, a brass lucky coin used in the saloon scenes. On the back, faintly etched, were the initials GS and the single word, partner. "Something to remember California by?" Geo said. "And good luck, partner. Go build a better script." Hans clutched the coin. He looked at Geo, seeing the man who had extended a hand and a sandwich when he was most hungry. He managed a simple reply. "Thank you, Herr Sterling. For everything." Hans climbed the steps of the transport bus. As the truck rumbled away, Hans looked back. Geo Sterling was still standing there, raising his hand in a slow salute. Hans realized he was not leaving the land of illusion, but the place where he had found his first piece of real, undeniable truth. The journey across the American continent felt long. He held the brass coin, the weight of the word partner, a promise of human kindness more certain than any official peace treaty. The winter of 1946 arrived in Germany with a frigid, suffocating grayness. Hans Richter stepped off the train in his ruined hometown, confronting a world of jagged stone and ash. His university was a shell. His family home was rubble. The emotional impact was overwhelming, yet Hans found himself anchored by the small brass coin. He was surrounded by suspicion and scarcity. The propaganda had prepared his people to hate the Americans. The wreckage confirmed the scale of the harm they had suffered. Hans, however, carried a different truth. Due to his proficiency in English, he quickly found work as a translator for the American occupation forces. This placed him on the front line of reconciliation. When he met American soldiers who were hardened by combat or Germans who spoke bitterly, Hans had a single, simple anecdote he would tell. He would speak of George Sterling, the B-list actor with the oversized hat and the frayed nerves and the roast beef sandwich. He would recount the moment the untouched sandwich was offered, not as an act of pity, but as a simple human response to another man's hunger. He never presented it as a heroic tale, but as an ordinary miracle. The story was met with disbelief. Germans found it impossible to reconcile the generous American with the bombings. American officers chuckled, assuming Hans was embellishing, but the story's power lay in its mundane honesty. It wasn't about tanks or strategy. It was about a sandwich, a prop coin, and a shared moment of dignity. It reminded people that the vast concept of the enemy was built from millions of insecure, hungry, and occasionally kind individuals. As Europe began its reconstruction, Hans devoted himself to teaching. He started an unofficial class, gathering neighborhood children amidst the rubble. He taught them English, not from official textbooks, but from copies of American comic strips and discarded film scripts. He taught them to say partner and howdy. And he always told them the story of the B-list cowboy who forgot the rules of war, and in doing so, offered a profound lesson in humanity. The brass coin, inscribed G.S. Partner, sat on his desk, a quiet testament to the fact that even in the most manufactured of environments, a Hollywood set, genuine human connection could occur. Hans Richter understood that the true work of peace would not be done in grand halls, but in these small, everyday acts of trust. The story of the shared sandwich was his small piece of evidence, a seed of reconciliation that he planted in the hearts of a new generation. The former prisoner of war carried the real treasure of America with him, the quiet, effortless grace found in the simplest offering of mercy. The greatest victories are often found not on the battlefield, but in quiet human moments. If you appreciate these surprising true stories that change everything we think we know about history, please subscribe and like this video to help us keep telling them.